Welcome to the Numerical Tarot. A new tarot paradigm. An alternative to tradition. An axial system of archetypal crystallography. A transculturally anthropomorphized, life-biased binary influence calculator. A wisdom system and archetype enhancer, with harmony of interpretation throughout. The content of all the videos in this series are excerpts, edits and brief summaries from the eBooks All Things Are Numbers and All Things Are Patterns, links below. For a more complete explanation of each idea, additional reading might be helpful. Hopefully the basic ideas come across enough to pique your interest in trying this alternative approach to tarot. In the previous video, we offered a detailed examination for how a possible, fictional universe could be brought into being. That process featured a three-step, hierarchical descent from the completely ineffable concept of paradox, through the idea of chaos and nothingness, to the solid foundation of order or everythingness. This trinity of initial development was to be considered an instantaneous act of creation, slowed down into individual steps for purposes of segmented analysis. Now, we want to examine how this idea of a trinity of development gets repeated, as we enter into the actual steps of coagulation. When we examine the steps of coagulation, we observe how our evolving model is recursive in design. A recursive system is like a movie about the making of a movie, within another movie, or a painting of yourself, painting a painting of yourself, painting a painting of yourself, or like a reflection of a mirror in a mirror. The idea of repeating a form within another form means that recursive systems go on infinitely in whatever direction is appropriate to their form. However, because we have described infinity as an illusion resulting from the endless traverse of the model through the paradox of 2 points of absentia, we can see how our recursive system will adopt a theoretical end to its apparent endlessness. By observing the recursive tendencies of creation, we reinforce the ideas put forth in the law of sequence, of a closed system that is forever stepping up and never really going anywhere. Because the essence of the first few stages of the recursive model deal with intangible formless concepts, like absentia and nothingness, they remain outside the scope of the model itself. The model itself is represented by the more terrestrial concepts of limits, space, mass, crust, mantle, core, etc. And when we reach the singularity at the center, we connect back to the outer absentia. Here's how. 1. In the first of these four progressions, we have three steps from the anti-model of the non-universe, or the absentia, to the beginning of the finite form. 1. Absentia, 2. Nothingness, 3. Something, or 1. Paradox, 2. Chaos, 3. Order. Together, the relatively finite stages of coagulation become the fourth step of this first progression. 2. Continuing into the relatively finite stages of coagulation, we encounter the beginning of the finite mass, or inner cluster, in three similar steps. 1. Circumsphere, 2. Atmosphere, 3. Terrasphere, or 1. Finite limits, 2. Space displaced, 3. Finite mass. The interior of the mass becomes the fourth step of this second progression. 3. The third progression then converges on the central point, or inner absentia, in three additional steps. 1. Outer crust, 2. Mantle, 3. Inner core or center. The contents of the core, or center, become the fourth stage of this third progression. 4. Of course, upon entering the core, or singularity of a center, we immediately return to the realm of the outer absentia via its impossible connection to the inner absentia. And, as a result, we find ourselves at the beginning of the first progression in three steps. Three nested progressions, which in turn become the first three steps of an all-encompassing fourth progression. Each one sharing the same transcendent center with the same inner absentia, thus allowing continued progress toward the absentia, with continued progressions, to be infinite, like any recursive system. Thus, by simultaneously passing into and out of a single absentia, the appearance of endless definition is achieved. An illusion? Needless to say, chasing one's tail over the recursive model and the endlessly inward characteristics of coagulation is confusing. Inventing a system that uses paradox and infinity to define parameters of existence will undoubtedly require patience to understand. Luckily for us, though, this type of paradoxical, recursive confusion has a tangible counterpart we can point to and use to help understand the form being created. In this case, the tangible counterpart is that of a simple Mobius strip. For those who don't know, a Mobius strip is a topographical paradox made from a strip of paper having, obviously, two sides. In describing the form of the Mobius strip, we find that if the ends of this paper are brought together in a normal fashion, we create a simple circular, banded shape, retaining the two-sided nature of the paper. But, if we simply twist one end before fastening, we end up with a shape which appears to retain its two sides, but which in fact has only one. The paper is still paper, it has two sides, but they have now been combined to create a one-sided form. For anything to have only one side is impossible if we adhere to the law of opposites, and yet the Mobius strip and the seemingly one-directional model just described exist. Lots of people have pondered the Mobius strip for a long time. Many conclusions have been made about the nature of these shapes. However, as I see it, the trick to the Mobius strip is that it is not strictly a one-sided figure. It is in fact a one-sided figure made from two sides. In other words, in the formation of the Mobius strip, two sides have been merged to form one. Because of this, we might conclude that in fact the one-sided effect could not happen without the two sides that create it. Upon reaching this conclusion, we could then observe how, in a similar manner, our two-sided universe of everything and nothingness has also been twisted into a one-sided affair of endless definition. In this case, the absentia, or predictable paradox, provides the conceptual twist of logic that brings these two into one. However, in my opinion, the interesting thing about the Mobius strip is how it does, in fact, exemplify the law of opposites and the predictable paradox by being an entity that is simultaneously one-sided and two-sided at the same time. This is why it is such a perfect analogy for describing the conditions created by the law of opposites and paradox, that of violation and restoration or contradictory objectives within a single entity. The next step in applying this two-into-one Mobius idea to our model is to imagine the Mobius strip as a Mobius sphere. If we look again at the Mobius strip, we notice that it has a circular appearance. As we incorporate this information into the model, this circular appearance must be translated into a spherical appearance. To do this, we make note of the fact that for one half of the Mobius circle the paper remains straight and for the other half it is twisted. This means that when we apply this information to our model, the straight side of the Mobius strip becomes akin to the outside, belonging to the outer absentia, while the twisted side belongs at the heart of our model and its moving matter, converging on the inner absentia. That's how we arrange the analogy of form, but what happens to our perception of the universe when we alter it this way? The answer is that our notion of sides becomes challenged. We've been talking about a universe with two sides, chaos and order, coming from a singularity, the absentia, and then proceed to show those two sides to be a one-directional process situated between two singularities. So our universe isn't really two-sided at all. At first this may seem like a horrendous state of logical confusion, capable of tearing apart all previous conclusions. But, by observing the contradictory objectives between these two viewpoints, and reminding ourselves of the laws that govern them both, we are able to conclude that in fact both conditions are true, thus creating for us a universe of ultimate symmetry. By establishing a one-sided absentia that is split into two and a two-sided universe that is merged into one. Once again, symmetry and broken symmetry in a single entity event. The universe on a Mobius strip represents universal reciprocity at its finest. Yin and Yang would be proud. Actually, to be perfectly precise, the absentia does represent a singularity in nature, but obviously the trick is that this singularity has two sides, just like the Mobius strip. It's only because of the divergent aspects of its form, being within as well as beyond definition, that the absentia must be thought of in two parts. To me, a singularity comprised of two parts equals a Mobius effect, one side made from two. Also, by carrying us across two opposing aspects of its form, with one continuous loop of endless definition or infinite expanse, the universe that we've created mimics the Mobius effect with uncanny similarity, and all from one simple twist. A twist that results from a reluctantly adopted foundation of paradox and the motion of development created by the law of opposites and cycles of infinity. The result being the foundation for the ultimate binary system. The binary result of the Mobius effect will eventually govern our perception of everything, but the real importance of this idea lies more in its possible applications to universal laws. The idea being that you could be twisting paper, logic, or even the matter of the universe and getting the same end result, each instance creating identical Mobius-like conditions with external differences characteristic to the elements of the form. For example, in our case the twisting of paper would result in a one-sided object, while in the case of logic, we get a one-sided universe of endless definition. In the case of matter, we might encounter a similar condition of endless definition within subatomic particles. The fact is, the Mobius sphere encloses every element of any universe created by our five laws, either individually or collectively. The universe on a Mobius sphere is an optical illusion of the contemplative mind. It will never be resolved in any finite fashion and will always leave us chasing our tail. Contemplating a universe without knowing it has a Mobius shape is maddening. Going around in circles is one thing, going around a Mobius strip is craziness, it keeps offering us two sides when there is only one, and then back again. Thus the universe on a Mobius becomes a weird trap from which there is no escape, like a grand cosmic sandwich, we exist between 2 points of singularity, with paradoxical potential that forever loops us around, we enter by leaving and we can only leave by entering. Therefore, to deny the Mobius idea will undoubtedly leave us chasing our tail, forever. On the other hand, by deliberately beginning our universe with a preposterous assumption of paradox and contradictory objectives, we are now able to recognize that that is in fact our own tail that we perceive, and as a result we can now cease and desist from chasing it. Thus, with painstaking logic and a simple twist, we are led to a conclusion that not only reminds us of the limitations of logic itself, but also defines for us what it is that prevents certain intangibles from ever being defined. This sort of liberation is similar to the objective of many religious and philosophical models, where the act of asking questions is squelched by the paradox of knowing more by not asking, or seeing more by not looking. In these philosophies, one does not simply give up on understanding because of the perceived futility of it all, but instead revels in the freedom of never knowing and not striving. Paradox is then perceived as a good place to be, while it becomes the purpose of devices like koans to put us there, i.e., stay confused and you are divine. But wait, there's more. Believe it or not, there's more for us to learn from this spherical Mobius idea. In translating the Mobius strip into a Mobius sphere, we drew a diagram that looked a lot like a planet with a magnetosphere around it. The shape I am referring to is that of a sphere collapsing at its poles into cone-shaped structures that converge in a twisting manner upon a center. In a cross-section of our evolving model, this would look like a figure 8 on its side. This magnetosphere shape represents additional lines of force within the model, as coagulation creates each perimeter and area of containment in 5 steps, or 4 steps and a central point. 1. The outer reaches of the magnetosphere shape correspond to the outer sphere of the model, the circumsphere, or the pause at the peak of the fountain where nothingness changes, to begin the steps of finite coagulation. 2. The path down, to the bottom of the magnetosphere cones, corresponds to the area around the cluster, the atmosphere, or the beginning of converging forces. 3. Next, the pause that occurs at the infinitesimal bottom point of the cones, the trough, corresponds to the pause at the surface of the cluster, where converging lines of force meet before fusing into a mass. The terrasphere. 4. The path up the cones corresponds to the cluster itself, and the twist of the Mobius sphere, as converging lines of force spiral together to form the substance of manifestation. The ignosphere. 5. Finally, the center is the center, or inner absentia, as defined by the spiraling mass around it. Thus, with the advent of the Mobius magnetosphere, we are able to affirm the numerical significance of our models for spheres and point by demonstrating an isomorphic connection between them. These are the fundamental parameters of our finite model, its limits: 1. Space, 2. Physical surface, 3. And substance, 4. A hierarchy of relative definition. These 4 spheres and point of development represent the 5 ways of being, and I believe they remain fundamentally unchanged throughout all forms of finite definition, as well as conscious thought. And so with these final points, we can end the more elaborate path of explaining how a very simple model of 4 circles and a point could be conceived in our mind's eye. The more simple approach, mentioned at the beginning of all this, is much easier to grasp. It allows us to move directly into further analysis of how the numbered stages of that model reveal archetypal characteristics to humanity. But this long drawn-out path tells us much more about those stages of development, and do much more to suggest the universality of the resulting form. I know this path of Genesis logic is hard to follow, especially as it ends with concepts like recursion and paradox. But hopefully by following all this, it will be seen that there is a lot more to our original creation of 4 circles and a point than just 4 circles and a point. This path of Genesis logic makes our static model into something much more dynamic and alive, which makes it more of a believable source for anthropomorphized icons of tarot. Now, with this clearer and more elaborate view of what our theoretical model of existence looks like, we can dig deeper and deeper into other aspects of its form and give additional sources for the character of numbers along the line that get translated into descriptions of humanity in a tarot deck. And with that, we conclude the long drawn-out Genesis logic of our theoretical model of existence, from which we draw all conclusions about the archetypal nature of everything. But before we do that, there is more to say about this curious notion of absentia. In the meantime, thanks for watching. Hope it all made sense. Links to eBooks, decks and merchandise below. And, if anyone is interested in drawing a deck based on this system of organization and strange metaphysical foundation, don't hesitate to contact me for a collaboration.